No matter what type of tip or guide video that I release, I always get the same response in the comment section. It is impossible to win the game with a trash tank. And while there's a lot to this that I understand and agree with this, there's a huge other section that actually allows you to enable a tank or even carry the worst of tanks. So we're going to break it all down and teach you how to win with the trash tank. But smash that subscribe so we can get to 50,000 subscribers, and check out the stream Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 6 p.m. CST in the description down below. Now, a lot of the time, players ask me who I think is the most impactful role in the game right now, and I tell them tank. I think it's undoubtedly tank. I recently climbed to GM and top 500 on tank, and I don't think I've ever climbed that easy in my life. Once I got good enough on tank, I felt like most games were within my control. So then that definitely means that if you are up against a really great tank and your tank is really bad, those games are going to be quite hard to win. But the problem is there's many situations where your tank is actually not as bad as you think, and the enemy tank is not as good as you think. Because the thing is, every single time I release a guide or anything like that, everyone says that they can't win. They can't climb because they keep getting trash tanks. And everyone is saying this. But how is it possible that every single person is getting trash tanks? And what even is a trash tank? Now, I think that we can all agree that a tank that basically just goes way away from their team, dives really far away, stays out, and feeds and dies is a bad tank, right? But we could also agree that a tank that basically never pushes in and holds the S key or pulls back on their freaking joystick is also equally as bad, right? They're not creating any space at all. But outside of that, there's tanks of all different types. There's tanks that just take space. There's tanks that just push in with their team. There's tanks that go above and beyond and get crazy hooks or go for insane plays, carry fights. And the majority of the time, you're going to get a tank along that spectrum that goes along with the skill of your rank. So the trick here, though, is there's going to be a lot of games where the enemy tank is a lot better than your tank. And your tank is going to look like one of these really, really bad tanks because they are getting thrashed. But they definitely do win games sometimes because that's how they're in the same rank as you. They do climb. So you have to ask yourself, what can you do to make up the tank gap? What can you do to make it so that your tank has the advantage and your tank actually is able to perform? Now, there's several things that you need to identify right when you get into the game. What is the tank matchup like? What is your tank playing versus the enemy tank? So let's say hypothetically, your tank is a Roadhog up against an Orisa. Realize that the Orisa's entire job is going to be primarily shutting down your tank, which means two things. One, your tank is probably not going to go for any crazy plays or be able to pull off anything insane. Probably not going to have a lot of crazy impact. But two, the Orisa is going to be occupied primarily with your tank, which is something that you can abuse, and we'll talk more about that later. Or perhaps the enemy is playing a Reinhardt and your tank is playing a Sigma. So the enemy Rein is often going to try to close in the gap, create a brawl or a close range engagement with your Sigma, while your Sigma is going to be trying to keep the enemy at distance or fight at distance because that's their effective range. Basically, by understanding the tank matchups, you can better serve to help your tank not get diffed or set up a more optimal engagement for what is ultimately the win condition, which is your tank winning the tank fight. The last tank standing is often a complete win condition for these fights. So let's say, hypothetically, in that Ryan situation, the Ryan constantly comes in to your Sigma and you're a Lucio that constantly boops them away. Or when the Ryan swings, you're an Ana that constantly sleeps the Ryan or nades the Ryan. Or you're a DPS that puts damage and value and pressure into the Ryan shield, so by the time the Ryan is close, it's super easy to deal damage and break that shield, or you're putting pressure in the enemy backline as the enemy Ryan is engaging. There's a lot of things that you can do to make it so that your tank still gets to play in that sweet spot where they want to. Now, ultimately, if you had a great tank, would they be able to manage this themselves, properly distance, make sure that the Ryan never got close to them, all these things that a really great tank could do? Yeah, probably. But at the end of the day, if you want to win the game, then you have to find a way to make up the tank gap. It's the only way for you to be able to win. And if you don't even understand how your tank lines up against the enemy tank, how in the world are you going to interject yourself with your picks or your play in order to make sure that your tank is being the most effective that they can be while neutralizing the enemy tank's effectiveness? The next thing that you got to do is you got to find the enemy tank difference. How good is this enemy tank compared to your tank? And is it actually because that tank is better that they're getting more value? Sometimes you as an individual or your team is actually what is creating easy opportunities for the enemy tank. So let's say it's the hog be hog mirror. Every time your tank goes for a hog play, there's peel that happens, there's pressure, there's a nade, there's a sleep. But every time their hog flanks, none of those things happen. So it's important to really look and take note of how these engagements are happening, what is happening with both of these tanks, because it's super easy to just chalk it up to, you know, your hog playing bad and the enemy hog playing good, but most of the time it's not as simple as that. Now, another thing that you need to consider is what actually lines up properly with the tank. So let's say back into that hog v hog example, right? If the enemy is rocking an Ana Kiriko and your team is rocking a Lucille Mercy, your hog will never get the resources required in order to win the hog 1v1. Every time he's pushing forward, he's getting naded or slept. Every time he hooks the enemy hog, that hog is getting cleansed. Doesn't matter what happens, your hog will never be able to win. Now, should that hog probably swap, play something adaptable? That's what I would do. I would probably swap and play something more adaptable that doesn't require my team to play around me, but not everyone is going to be able to swap. Not everyone's going to acknowledge that they should swap, and that hog might just not want to swap because they feel like they're hitting good hooks. They feel like they're better than the enemy tank, and maybe they are, but they don't have the resources from their team. And you, as an individual, need to acknowledge when it's possible for you to get your tank to swap, get your tank to adapt, or when you should be the one adapting instead. Realize at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is the dub, and if your tank keeps getting outplayed or shut down, you probably won't win. So you have to think about what is causing that. What is the enemy tank getting that your tank is not? How is the matchup playing out? 90% of the time, it's not simply a skill issue that is creating this, and there's always ways that you can aid to whatever skill issue is being created with your picks, with your play. Now, that being said, there is one scenario where those weird scenarios where your tank is just getting completely clowned on. They're not doing anything right. They're going in and feeding, or they're not pushing it at all. They're constantly getting diffed, and it feels like no matter what happens, you can't help this tank win the tank 1v1. In those scenarios, you need to go characters that can allow you to have direct impact on the enemy backline, and characters that allow you to completely ignore the tank. Characters like Pharah Mercy, characters like Tracer that can go on the backline, go aggressively, characters like Widowmaker. And along with that, if you're a support, you can go supports that enable these characters, or supports that don't enable your tank, but instead enable your DPS or enable your own proactive plays. The idea in this situation is that you've acknowledged that your tank is not creating or doing the things that they need to do, and you would have to put in way more resources than you can or that is possible in order to allow your tank to win. So instead, you have to go create value on the battlefield around and outside the tank that allows you to carry and win the team fight. And it definitely is possible. You can have games where there is a huge tank discrepancy, but your tank just doesn't feel like they can do anything. And as an example, some of the games that I lost on my climb on tank, I was actually doing a lot better than the enemy Orisa, let's say in an Orisa mirror, right? I was doing a lot better than them. I was managing my cooldowns really well. I was managing natural cover really well. I was hitting a lot of skewers. I was blocking a lot of their skewers, and that was happening a lot. But then my DPS and my supports kept on getting picked up by an enemy Widow or an enemy Tracer. And this was stuff that I couldn't interact with. I couldn't do anything. Even though I was a better tank than the enemy tank, I couldn't interact with any of that stuff that was happening. So while I understand that the tank diff oftentimes decides these games, wins and losses, to just say that you have no impact and no say over whether or not you win these games, and it's purely a coin flip whether or not you get the better tank, that's simply not true, and it's something that you need to acknowledge if you actually want to climb. Anyways, you might agree or disagree with me, but definitely let me know in the comments down below. Smash that subscribe, check out the stream, and I'll see you next time.